So I'll get Margaret up here in a jiffy. I would just start off by saying it feels wrong to be at a conference focused on municipal corruption in New York City without starting by talking about Boss Tweed, who is probably the model of corruption. Nobody did it as well or as infamously, I think, as Boss Tweed, who was the leader of Tammany Hall, the political organization here in New York City, and just perfected graft and corruption, bribery, to a degree that is really stupendous and deserving of recognition. When I was a speechwriting intern for Mayor Giuliani in the 90s, worked in the Tweed Courthouse, which is like the monument to Boss Tweed's corruption. It was something that was supposed to have cost $250,000, and because of Tweed, ultimately cost $13 million back then in the 1860s, which, to give you some perspective, was 6 times what St. Patrick's Cathedral cost, and almost 3 multiples of what it cost to buy all the land for Central Park, because the project was attended by incredible corruption and embezzlement and extortion connected to New York City funds. So, to name an example, the guy who did the plaster work was a crony of Tammany Hall, and he got paid what would be today roughly $1.8 million for 2 days worth of work on the courthouse. Just an incredible achievement. And it's in the year that Tweed finally was brought down, finally tried and convicted, that the predecessor to DOI was born in 1873. And so if Tweed was the model of corruption, DOI certainly is the model of what an anti-corruption agency can be. And over the years, thanks to extraordinary leaders like Rose Gilhern, that agency has become, almost without peer in the world for rooting out corruption, exercising appropriate oversight of city functions. And we're fortunate that right now there's a model leader for that model agency in Margaret Garnett, whose main achievement, I think, is having been a friend of mine for almost 13 years. But other than that, Margaret went to fancy schools and got degrees at Notre Dame and Columbia, among other places, after being an associate at one of the best law firms in the city and a law clerk to a fancy federal judge. She's had a long career in public service, first working for about a little over 12 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York, where, among other things, she was the chief of appeals, just one of the most prestigious jobs in that office, and the chief of the Violent Crime and Organized Crime Unit, and won many honors, including the Stimson Medal of the City Bar Association, which goes to a stupendous achiever. Margaret won one. Brendan McGuire, who's here, won one. I wasn't nominated. It was rigged. But then after that, she was an executive deputy attorney general in the New York Attorney General's office, where she oversaw tons of lawyers and investigators in the criminal division there. And after about 2 years, late last year, she became the commissioner of the Department of Investigation, and in a short period of time has already won almost universal acclaim for her leadership, for her stewardship, for steering the agency through some rocky public times, and really helping that agency focus on its core mission. And we're so lucky to have her here today, and I'll invite her up now and lead the applause for her. Why don't you go in the center? They're here.
We decided to do just talk instead of a speech, which hopefully you'll all find more interesting.
So it will be a fireside chat with no fire, and probably not a lot of chat, frankly. But I will start it off, and I wrote my questions. Teeing off with this one. So at a recent seminar, Margaret told what I thought was an incredible story, a parable for our times, about 2 employees that she worked with at DOI, who were in DOI statistics bureaus. So we'll call them Donna and Alice, as she did. And she said that One of them was prepping her for a city council hearing, on relevant statistics related to DOI. And throughout the 90-minute prep, Margaret, kept calling this woman Donna. And it was only after that she was told that for 90 minutes she had been calling this person by the wrong name. In fact, it wasn't Donna she had been with, but Alice. And no one corrected her. Not Alice, not her direct staff, no one in the room. And from that, Margaret said, it taught lessons about the importance of creating freedom to speak up and correct. And I think, in many ways, it helps us to understand why it's so important there is a DOI. Because when you've got people in positions of power, others shy away from speaking up or drawing attention to themselves or inviting, risk, for their career, because it's just sometimes easier to look the other way and let powerful people do what they want with powerful things and lots of money. And so my first question to you will be, how much does that tell us about why DOI is important, and why do you think DOI is so essential to the integrity of this city?
So, I think there's a couple sort of meanings for me to be drawn from that story. Can everybody hear me? Do I need this mic on?
Is this one?
I just talk loud. I use my trowel.
Move the microphone closer to you.
I can. I absolutely can. Thank you. A couple lessons to be drawn from that story, I think, one is definitely that insight into how hard it is for people to speak up when the people who they perceive to be powerful are doing wrong. And I think that goes a lot to, what DOI's mission is, and I think to the hard work, most of our work is focused on cases, but we also have kind of an education and outreach component to try to convince city workers and contractors and members of the public that they should come forward. And I think one of the best ways to convince people that they should come forward is to take their complaints seriously, to both in fact and in perception pursue those cases with independence and vigor, to let people see the work that we're doing, and that in fact if you come forward, your complaints will be acted on, you'll be treated with dignity, with anonymity if that's what you need to come forward. And I think getting that message out through our work is incredibly important, because it's a huge risk for people to come forward with wrongdoing, particularly against people who they perceive as more powerful than themselves. And the only way to encourage that is to show people that if you do come forward, we'll take those complaints seriously and act on them. I think the other piece of that story for me, why I talked about it in the speech you reference, is that it's also like it was for me a very powerful leadership lesson of like how much people will defer to you, which mostly having worked in agencies where deference was not so much the norm, that was a shock to me to sort of realize, like in a very concrete way, that people would defer to me even when I was so obviously wrong about an objective fact, like not even a difference of opinion, or like, well, Margaret's the commissioner and this is her vision or priority or whatever, so we're going to go along. But and to try to keep an awareness of that and not get used to deference, to try to create a culture where people see that it's more important to do right than to be right. So it's okay to be wrong, it's okay to disagree, it's okay to challenge if your collective goal is to end up in the right place. And I certainly don't think that I know everything. In fact, I'm new to city government. This is my first job in city government. So to try to create internally at DOI what we expect of city agencies, that people will object, that they will disagree, that they will do whatever they think needs to do, so that at the end of the process we're doing right and not just trying to be right.
Great, and let me, I am probably more deferential, just by nature.
Not to me, you're not.
No, so Don
I've never observed
question.
that.
Yeah, no, it's great. Okay, so you were speaking though a moment ago about the breadth of the work of DOI and priorities. And so you've got an ample but limited, because it's finite, budget. How do you go about setting priorities for the broad-ranging work that DOI does? Obviously, all of it's important, but is some more important than others?
Yeah, I mean, so the breadth of our authority is huge. I mean, the New York City is huge, and I learned recently that the city's workforce is the third largest government workforce in the country. So it's the federal government is number one, state of California number two, New York City number three. And in part, that's because the city does so many things. I mean, just police and Department of Education alone are a larger workforce than most states have as their entire state workforce. So, and I think for me, it's been exciting and sort of surprising, the incredible breadth of everything that the city is doing, the number of employees, the services, the number of agencies. So I think you want to make sure that you're not missing anything. And I think of priorities in kind of two different ways. One is to make sure that that you're sort of good stewards of your financial pool of money. And that, again, is, I think, when you're an oversight agency, you also have this function of trying to model good governance for the agencies you oversee. So for me, it's been a priority to try to shift money and resources to casework and to make sure that that's our top priority, that our spending on personnel and equipment and everything is focused on our casework. When you, it's my first time as an agency head, and I can see how easy it is to kind of fall in love with having a big staff around you and toys and lots of fancy things. And I think it's really important to resist that and to make sure that our financial priority is reflected as the casework is the most important thing. The second piece of that is subject matter priorities. So the city has a lot of pressing problems, some that are in the news. NYCHA, of course, perennially, corrections, for sure, two big priorities. But to me, I think it is better for priorities to grow out of the casework. And defining priorities as being able to shift and respond to make sure that you are supporting the best and most important cases that you have. So it's one thing you could sit back and say, well, I, Margaret Garnett, think that the biggest problem in the city is X. But I hope I have enough humility about the complexity of the city that I'm not sure that is the best way to go, right? So I think you want to be responsive. Like right now, we have a lot of really terrific cases in the deal with affordable housing and sort of ensuring fair access and fair administration of affordable housing in the city. And I think you can see that growing out of the casework, and you want to make sure that you are putting resources to support the most important cases that you have. And sort of the third piece of that, I would say, is there can be some tension between everyday small cases and chasing what seem like big cases. In my own experience as a prosecutor, I think big cases are not just, for the most part, are not just sort of lying around on the ground waiting for you to pick them up and recognize them as big cases. That's, with very rare exceptions, that's not how it works. And you can waste a lot of time and resources chasing a hypothetical big case. And meanwhile, you are missing all that could be made of cases that seem small at the beginning. And when you you mentioned Boss Tweed at the beginning, and I think we're incredibly fortunate right now in New York City that most city corruption is in the form of what people would think of as a small case. But those cases are really important to me because they mostly represent the primary way that most citizens experience city government. So if you have a Department of Health inspector who is taking a $1,000 bribe from the operator of a food truck to give them a passing inspection, that by itself is a small case, but that level of corruption sort of within the food truck community really damages people's, that's the primary way that those people are experiencing city government and its honesty and its work in the public interest. And if word will spread in the community that some people are doing right, some people are bribing their way to success. You can bribe your way to success. That's incredibly destabilizing to people's belief in the rule of law and honest government. And I think at DOI, those kinds of cases are cases that if we are not doing them, no one is doing them for the most part. So I want to, a priority for me is to try to find a balance to make sure that we are continuing to do those cases and put resources into them, because I really believe that part of our mission is to try to promote the public's faith in honest government, because I think, we're living in kind of a hard time for faith in honest government, and it's incredibly destabilizing in hundreds of ways that are hard to foresee if people lose their sense that government employees are acting primarily in the public interest and not for personal advantage. So I want to make sure that we're continuing to do those small cases, do them effectively, professionally, and that we are doing them in a way that we can recognize and grow things that might start small into big cases that can have a systemic impact.
So, picking up on what you just said about the difficult time we live in, we'll stay away from, just crude politics, but one thing that I think is true is that there's been a lot of discussion about whether norms are enough to keep ethical governance in place. And that's true, for example, if there's a practice of, responding to oversight requests or taking seriously alleged violations of ethical rules, right? If you put that aside and you say, well, we don't care, something happens. And so I guess my question for you is, you benefit from the great work that so many others have done before you in making city government as clean as possible and building public faith in government. How fleeting could that be? And how much do you worry that with some bad decisions or bad actors, that perception and that tradition could be lost or diminished? And are norms enough?
Yeah, I think one thing we're realizing from our national life and from city events too and DOI is that norms are only enough if the people who are charged with upholding them believe in them. And, I think even very enduring, what we thought of as very enduring norms like the independence of DOJ or for DOI, like the presumption that city agencies will comply with our requests and be fully cooperative, that those things endure only because if you have people in power who believe in them, and that I think it has prompted a lot of reflection in our national conversation. I think in the city too about whether norms are enough, and I think there are institutional things you can do to ensure a greater degree of independence. I think, for DOI right now, a huge amount of our power is in the form of an executive order, which in theory could be rescinded by a mayor at any time, which I think is not great. That's not a great setup. There's been talk about whether the DOI commissioner or the corporation council, this is now one of the charter revision proposals, whether certain city positions that ought to have independence and be officers of the city and not of the mayor should be appointed for terms of years rather than tied to mayoral terms. I think those ideas are definitely worth talking about, although, as we saw with Jim Comey's firing, like that was the idea behind the FBI director's term. And I think that people thought that was a norm that had become really ingrained in Washington. But turned out not to be as, I think, rock solid as people thought. So, you know, the difficult, you know, there are other measures. You can have budgetary rules. I learned recently that the Montreal equivalent of DOI, which is, it's not exactly equivalent because they're primarily focused on the overseeing major capital projects in Montreal. They have a fixed budget that's a percentage of the city's capital budget to ensure that they have the resources they need to do their job, even if there is a mayor or city council that's not supportive of oversight. So I think there are things, you know, one thing that's quite difficult is that the more rules and oversight you put in place over prosecutors and investigators, you know, in some ways the harder it is for them to be independent. You know, when I was going through my city council confirmation process, I had a lot of questions about, well, should the DOI commissioner be elected? Should the DOI commissioner have to be more responsive to city council? Like, wouldn't that be a check on the mayor's ability to interfere with the DOI commissioner? And some of those things have some superficial appeal, but I think the more that political considerations can be injected into any kind of investigative or prosecutorial institution, to my mind, I think it actually creates more risk that more political forces will try to interfere or use the power of investigators and oversight officials for their own ends. So I think it's very challenging. I don't have all the answers.
Oh, come on. Of course you do, Margaret. It's interesting, though, on the sort of independence of the DOI commissioner creating a structured term. After Watergate, there was a proposal for, on the federal level, the Department of Justice to be independent in that the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, and the Solicitor General should be appointed for a fixed term that would extend beyond a president. And it got universally panned, including, you know, by major bar associations, leading lawyers on both sides of the aisle, even, you know, Archibald Cox, whose firing led to, you know, the Midnight Massacre, Saturday Night Massacre?
Saturday Night Massacre.
There were a lot of massacres. And even he opposed it. And, you know, that says something, right? That, you know, at the same time that you aspire to independence, there's also probably some measure of democratic accountability in linking an investigator to a publicly chosen elected official like a mayor.
Right. Well, and it is very tricky because, and I think maybe it goes back to our earlier thing of like, a lot is riding on who are the people exercising that power, people who believe in the norms of discretion, of restraint, because it is true, and I think rightly true, that, you know, investigators, as we are oversight agencies, prosecutors, have tremendous power, and you can, in the wrong hands, you can use that power to destroy people's lives indiscriminately, to really wreak a lot of havoc. But the more outside control there is, the more potential for people who have political agendas who are not independent, which I think is democracy, right? I mean, it's appropriate for people in the city council to have political agendas because they're elected officials and they are responsive to their constituents. But to try to keep some distance, to keep investigators, prosecutors, oversight officials independent from political concerns, but in some way exercising a degree of self-control, policing themselves so as not to create a situation where you have, and I think that's probably a lot of the resistance to this post-Watergate idea of the Attorney General and SG and the DAG should be, you know, essentially once they're in, they're untouchable for X number of years, is that you would be taking positions that already have an enormous, essentially only self-policed power to a large degree, and then making that completely unmoored from any kind of public responsiveness or democratic accountability. So finding a place that is in the middle of those two things is, I think, the sweet spot.
So what do you do? So you are watching the watchdog in effect, because you preside over a large agency that watches over everybody else. How do you build an ethical culture within DOI? Or how do you promote some of the messages that you've been, articulating today in terms of, using your power wisely, et cetera? Is that something you think about and feel is a presence in your day-to-day work?
I mean, I think about it every day, and how to do that. And I do think that as the agency head, you have to have personal responsibility for that, and really be mindful of it and thinking about it every day, and saying out loud as many times as you need to, whether in small groups or large, that at the end of the day, we're here to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. That's the only consideration. I'm experiencing for the first time, I think, the pressures of the New York City Press Corps and the political winds in the city, which I try to stay clear of, but you have to be savvy about. So, it's a challenge for me too, but I think it's helpful for me, and I hope the agency, to have people hear me say and then model in decision-making, both process and outcome, that yes, there are all these sort of forces coming from the outside, but we need to ignore those things and think about, what do we know, what is the law, what is the right thing to do, and make sure that we are making our decisions first about what is right, just, fair, what's supported by the facts, and then these other factors you manage after you've come to what you think is the right decision. I think to do for myself and model internally that, yes, you have to at some point think about public messaging. You have to think about what will be the political fallout of something that you do, but those considerations have to be separated from and made after we have come to a decision that we think is right, and to be prepared to take responsibility for sort of what should be that back half of thinking about the press or political consequences, and trying to model before the first half of let's make sure that we are making our decisions based internally only on what the facts support, and what is fair and just and right. So I think about it all the time. I think we have great people at DOI who are really committed public servants, so that helps. But yeah, I think it's important, and it's important for people to hear you say it as many times as you need to.
Let me just ask Barrett, how are we doing on time?
Are we over?
We're good? Okay, great. So in terms of the people of DOI, you have attracted a good deal of really high caliber talent. There's obviously a lot of super talented people there. In the first instance, is personnel something that you think about? And have you given thought to what you want to do to change the constitution of DOI, or how things are organized within DOI? It's still early in your tenure, but is personnel and structure something that you're thinking about?
Well, I have a lot of employees here, so I don't want to freak anybody out. No.
You're safe.
Just kidding.
It's fine. Yeah.
Just kidding. Look, I think when I was nominated for this job, I sought out a lot of people for advice. And I think one of the things that for me has proven true that a lot of people told me is that, it's important when you start something new as a head to have some of your own people around you, to use a crude term. So I was very fortunate at my previous job. It didn't seem fortunate to me at the time, but it proved to be fortunate that my previous boss resigned in disgrace, and thereby turned what I thought would be maybe a 5-year job into a 1-year job. So because of those external events, which I had nothing to do with, to be clear, I was really fortunate that I think when, much to my surprise, I found myself getting this job I have now, that I was able to bring with me people who I knew and trusted, and who I felt would be really good companions and helpers to embark upon this big, scary task. And so I think, to me, I think you want to think about having people around you who share your values, but who are good at things that you are not good at, or who know things that you don't know. And a key part of leadership for me, like when I went to the AG's office, I'd never been a state practitioner. I had never set foot in a state courtroom other than as an observer. And I was transparent about that in the interview process, that I'm not sure I'm the right person for this job because I really don't know almost anything about New York State criminal procedure or criminal law. And somehow they gave me the job anyway, but it was important to me, I think, in embarking on that job, to be clear with the people I was now supervising from the beginning that, listen, I don't know this. You need to tell me about this because I don't know. Here's what I think, but here's this huge thing that I don't know. And there's a big temptation, I think, when you get into a new role, that you're supposed to pretend that you know everything because people won't respect you if they don't perceive you as knowing everything. And that really has never worked for me. I'm not able to carry that off, I think, probably. But also, I just think it's not the right way to go, and that, maybe to circle back to where we started, that by you as a leader admitting the things you don't know, asking for help, saying you made a mistake or you don't know the answer or you need advice, you're giving other people permission to also do that, which I think is how you get the best out of people, to give them permission to admit mistakes, to say they don't know, to ask for help. So to me, coming into DOI, I'd never worked in city government. Despite a year at the AG's office, I still am really grossly deficient. As Dan Court is here, my first deputy, he can tell you, grossly deficient in my understanding of New York State criminal procedure and criminal law.
I believe that, yeah.
Yeah, it's true. Dan, do you have anything to say? And so that you can only, I think, exceed your own expectations if you have people around you who are better than you and who know more than you, who have strengths where you are weak or deficient, and to be open about that and to give them your proxy in a way that, hey, I need you, I'm looking to you, I trust you, I value your advice, I hope you can help me on this because you are really good at this thing that I am not really good at. And so for me, it's been a great gift to be able to bring some folks with me to DOI. And I think getting to know the hundreds of really talented people who work at DOI, and trying to think about how do you put people in the right spots where they can flourish and do their best work is an endlessly challenging managerial problem, but one that I think for me is really important.
Okay.
I see Brendan's giving us the eye. I feel like we're easing into his time.
Yeah, no, it's
just covering for.
Well, so I guess another question that comes to my mind, and we've spoken about this a little bit. So you are part of a particular mayoral administration, and you have colleagues that are effectively your peer, and a mayor and city council that you report to in some way. How do you interact with them? Do you see them? Right, and in some cases we've talked about they are agencies that are providers of services that you need, parking placards or whatever else. How do you negotiate the relationships with the other agency heads or City Hall? And is that tricky? Is it easy? Is it not something you think about?
No, it is tricky. I mean, I think that and we've talked about this, I think your role in White House Counsel and now as an in-house lawyer in a company that to navigate a role where you are in and of something, but also have to be separate, and also where a lot of your role is saying no, calling people out for doing the wrong thing, sometimes in ways that are very embarrassing to them or professionally damaging. But at the same time, as you touched on, so at DOI, we are a city agency, a mayoral agency, but and we oversee every other city agency and every city contractor and every city employee. But at the same time, because we are of the city and part of it, so DCAS is the administrative agency for the city, and they are, of course, one of the agencies we oversee. They also are charged with providing us with our office space and our cars and everything else that we need. Our paper that goes in the printer, DOT, we oversee them, and they have been the subject of DOI investigations like every other city agency. But they give us our parking placards, and if we need parking places on the street, DOT has to approve them. And I think my always default hope is that people are professional, and if you are professional and competent, and you're showing that day in and day out, that people will interact with you in the same way. But it is very tricky to navigate that. I think as far as the mayor and city hall, city council, it's easier for me in some ways, maybe. I think I benefit in some ways from the difficulties of the past. But also, I think like many DOI commissioners before me, certainly Rose here and Ed Karansky and Howard Wilson and many other great DOI commissioners, I've had a career before this, and I hope to have one after. It is not a political career. I have no political ambitions for myself. I've loved being a prosecutor and investigator and in public service, and I hope there will be other things after DOI, but I don't think ever, about how the work I'm doing now is advancing or hurting me. And I feel really blessed by the work I've done prior to this, that I feel freed from that I don't have to think about that. So I feel confident that if I was in a position where I felt I needed to resign, I would, without thinking twice about it. And so that feels like a tremendous gift to me, that puts me in a place, I think, not so different from many DOI commissioners, that I'm confident that if that situation arose, that it would not be a difficult decision for me. And doing that has given me, I think by its own fact, a lot of independence from those pressures. So I hope it continues.
So I guess just as one final question before there are others, this is a great assembly of talent from different places. Is there anything that you would want to say to this group that you haven't had a chance to yet because of terrible questioning? It's possible. No, I mean, we touch on this a little bit, what a tricky time it is for, government ethics and oversight work. And in the U.S., I think, as in many other countries, a lot of people are here from other places. And, but to be entrusted with that work I'm really grateful for that. And I think, sometimes so I mentioned that my prior boss had resigned in disgrace, and he was replaced by, to me, one of the most extraordinary people I've ever worked with, Barbara Underwood. And in the aftermath of all of that, I remember Barbara said to me, I was asking her how she was navigating the change from being SG to Attorney General and in such turbulent times, and I hope she won't mind me saying this in a public place. She said, well, it's complicated, but I really feel that I'm the right person in the right place at the right time, and I'm derived tremendous satisfaction from that. And, even when she's trying to navigate this very difficult situation. So I feel that way too, not so much that I personally am in the right place at the right time, but that
it's a gift. It's a great thing right now in difficult times to be doing such important work, and to be representing and fighting for principles that I think need good advocates right now. So I'm grateful for that, and it's very inspiring to be here with people who are doing that from all over the world.
Great. Thank you, Margaret Garnett.
Thanks.
Thank you all.